Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We have quite a lineup today, as you can see. I'm not doing the official opening and welcome. I'm just coming in to introduce myself. I'm Tasneem Fredericks. I am a trustee at the South End Museum, and I'd just like to acknowledge our other trustees in the room, Miley, Errol, and Ryan over there. So, of course, just having this event in a place like the South End Museum is such a historical event. My grandmother and my father all lived in South End, so of course the issue of the apartheid expropriation in South Africa and how it lends itself to what's happening in Palestine, it's very similar, and so it was so apt to have the event this evening here. So good afternoon, welcome to everyone. I'm just going to do a few house rules before we proceed with the items. So please, if you can all have your cell phones on silent, that would be great. And then to my left, be your right, the toilets are over there. And of course, the exits are at the back. There's just one other house rule that, and I'm sure, we're all friends sitting here, but we don't know who may slip in or come later. And I think it's just for me to say that this space and this platform is here to support and nurture Professor Haidar Eid. So if anyone is going to ask a pro-Zionist, pro-racist, pro-fascist, pro-hate question, I'm simply going to cut the mic. We're not even going to listen to the question, and I'm going to ask that person to leave. So it's a simple house rule. It's really, we don't need that kind of secondary victimization and trauma. Professor Haidar just survived a genocide. He managed to get out, but he'll speak more on that. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Andre Kiet to the podium to give us the official opening and welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tasneem. Honored guests, all present, I greet you in the name of peace. I am honored with the distinct pleasure of welcoming you to the launch of the book Decolonising the Palestinian Mind, written by a courageous friend, a deeply empathetic scholar, a dedicated human rights and social justice activist, and one of the most relentlessly hopeful and optimistic persons that I have had the pleasure of meeting, Haidar Eid. Of course, we've been reminiscing about so many old days, of course, because we know each other since the late 1990s. So we are engaging with this book as the death toll stands at around 45,000 Palestinians killed since October 7, 2023, and the numbers are continuously rising. Decolonising the Palestinian Mind by Professor Eid is a powerful critique of the Israeli occupation of Palestine and the normalization of Palestinian suffering. The book argues that the Palestinian struggle for liberation requires not only physical resistance, but also a decolonization of the mind. The notion of the normalization of Palestinian suffering has some connection with Butler's concept of grievable lives as a critical lens through which to understand the Palestinian struggle. This concept highlights the unequal valuation of human life, where some lives are deemed more worthy of mourning and protection than others. Butler argues that Palestinian lives has, over decades, been systematically devalued and rendered ungrievable. For this reason, Haidar calls for a radical rethinking of the Palestinian struggle. He emphasizes the importance of Palestinian culture, language, and history in resisting domination, also calling, of course, for solidarity from international activists and organizations to support the cause. Our own university sector in South Africa has been slacked in a system-wide response to the genocide, for which we have to apologize, Haidar, suggesting that we ourselves may be complicit in producing the normalization of Palestinian suffering. Our own university has been engaged on various fronts, but practical interventions around support for academics and students and structured programs on the Palestinian struggles have not yet fully taken shape. Though there are activist organizations, of course, very active in this regard, not only in our university, but also in our city. There seems to be various touch points, Haidar, between your work and that of our own, which require us to question our firmly held religious, cultural, political, and affective beliefs and assumptions and retune them towards an authentic sense of justice that can serve the Palestinian cause much better. This sometimes, I think, is a bridge too far, since it demands the courageous reflexivity that most of us so often lack. This battle is a fundamental psychological struggle aimed at puncturing one particular frontier, that is the decolonization of the mind as a prerequisite for true liberation, as Ngugi argued in one of his most famous works many, many years ago. For Palestine and its peoples, who are in the midst of an ongoing genocide, the situation is exceedingly more tragic than words can convey. The immense suffering, psychological trauma, violent displacement, and loss of life, while the world watches on, is an agonizing and surreal experience. Yes, yet amid this genocide, it is befitting to reflect on the work Decolonizing the Palestinian Mind, as it provides an intricate tapestry of past, present, and future aspirations. And there is so much to learn from it as we share a human story of endurance and resilience in the face of adversity between our two countries and peoples. With that, friends and colleagues, I wish you a warm welcome to this event and relay my sincerest gratitude to Haidar for making the time to engage with us and for the South End Museum for partnering with our university. Many, many thanks, and wishing you once again a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andre. I didn't acknowledge you because I thought you were going to acknowledge yourself, so now I'm going to have to acknowledge the VC and also just mention the special collaboration that we as the South End Museum share with yourselves, my alma mater, also aptly named Nelson Mandela University. So acknowledgement to the VC and his team, Samira, and also the other support staff that are here this evening. Before we move on to the next item, I had actually meant to do this at the beginning, but I think I was a little bit nervous, so I didn't do it. But I think if I can ask the audience to please indulge me, and if we could just rise and observe a moment of resistance for all the martyrs who have passed on in Gaza and in Palestine. Thank you so much. If I can now call upon Malia Jam, South End Museum trustee, to speak on the South African-Palestine link to forced removals.
Good afternoon to everybody. Assalamu alaikum, and once again, good afternoon to all. The South End Museum has welcomed a number of esteemed guests to its humble facility over its 23 short years of existence since 2001. Portraits of these struggle and human rights greats adorn our walls with pride, especially there on the right-hand side, my right, to the left there. And today, on behalf of the South End Museum, I have the honor and privilege to welcome the highly esteemed activist and intellectual of the Palestinian struggle, Professor Haidar Eid. Welcome, Professor. Professor Haidar Eid has an amazing story to tell, a story that is filled with heartache, horror, strength of belief, and the amazing resilience of the Palestinian people. We interviewed him on radio last night and learned that his best friend's 22-year-old son had just been martyred. early in the day. And he went on to mention that 50 of his relatives have been martyred thus far. It is heartbreaking and devastating to imagine just even one of our family members passing on through normal circumstances before their time. But it's totally unconscionable to experience the loss of 50. He also went on to say that although apartheid had ended 30 years ago, he still feels the vestiges of it till this day. Like the aftertaste of a terrible medicine. The South End Museum focuses on forced removals. In fact, I was a kid and I lived at the bottom of Rudolph Street. And we weren't much of activists. We just accepted our lot, which is ridiculous, but focuses on forced removals which occurred during the apartheid era of South Africa and ensures throughout the displays in its halls and walls that memory preservation is a critical tool in never forgetting this dark era in our country's history and ensuring that the generations to come will be informed and reminded of the horrendous discrimination and brutality the persecuted and severely disadvantaged had to suffer and endure and ultimately pay with their lives, like George Botha, who was murdered in detention and for whom an annual memorial lecture is held at the museum on his behalf. Professor Haidar is in Gqeberha today to launch his new book, Deconstructing the Palestinian Mind. And apologies, Prof, I haven't read your book yet, but I will tell you what ChatGPT has to say about it. If I may, Deconstructing the Palestinian Mind by Haidar Eid critically analyzes the complexity of Palestinian identity, culture, and politics in the context of ongoing occupation and conflict. Eid explores how historical narratives, social dynamics, and external influences shape the Palestinian consciousness. Through a deconstructive lens, he aims to challenge prevailing stereotypes and misconceptions, offering a nuanced understanding of the Palestinian experience. The book serves as both an academic analysis and a call for a deep engagement with the Palestinian narrative in discussions about justice and liberation. Once again, it's fantastic to have an individual of your caliber visit us, Professor Haidar, and we thank you for choosing our city and for making the time. And we wish you every success with the sale of your current offering, and we look forward to your message today. Lastly, I'm sorry about the weather. I think Tasneem could have done better with it. She normally gets everything right. Thank you very much.
Shukran, Mali. It's nice to hear nice words while you're still alive. So I don't have to wait until I die for you to say something nice. The next item that we have is going to be a video clip of the documentary Returning to Zarnuka. So if we can get that on screen, it looks like it's a 20-minute documentary.
So I'm standing looking at this cacti that they couldn't uproot. And I just know, it's you and your ancestors and your family, and yeah, you're part of, you're in the earth here, and whatever they uproot, it'll just come back, it'll just come back.
Absolutely.
Haidar.
Hi, Nessa.
Hi. So we sent the second link. I don't know if you managed to watch the first one.
Well, I am watching the first one. You're driving a car. I don't know what place is this.
They call this neighborhood Kiryat Moshe, and it's on the land of Zarnuga.
Like, it's like a middle class suburb somewhere. I don't know. That's what I'm watching right now, with cars, 4x4 cars, and modern cars and houses and villas. So what is that? Is that Zarnuga? That's not Zarnuga.
It is. That's on the land of Zarnuga. Yes, that's on the land of Zarnuga.
That's on the land of Zarnuga.
They built their kind of, where they put first Russian immigrant, and then more recently they put Ethiopian. And we know that it was like. Yeah, it was kind of a poor neighborhood on the outside of Rehovot. I don't think we've found everything that exists. I mean, the mosque exists. We were told
the mosque exists. Okay. Yeah, this is the mosque. Yeah.
Yes, that's the Muhammad Mosque.
You're standing there now, right?
Yes. And there are some trees here that I believe are older than 70 years old.
I can see you now.
Yeah. The mosque is,
So they're keeping the old bricks and stones in the same dome. Yeah. Look at that. How emotional one can get.
I can imagine.
Yeah, the thing.
Must be very painful.
Yeah, I was told about the mosque by my father and my mother. We're looking at the inside of the mosque right now, Nita. Yeah, it's. I think it was in the mid-70s that I went with my parents, my aunt, and my sister to Zarnuga, and there were still some houses, including, as far as I remember, a two-story building that belonged to my aunt. Of course, nobody lived there. They knew every inch of the village. They could walk in every single street, and they even gave, they even remembered the names that they had given to the trees.
Wow.
It was an orchard. Yeah, it was an orchard. I remember that. I can't remember. I think it was between 5 and 7 years old at the time. So it was, early mid-70s. I remember when my father and my mother started crying. I mean, after we left, and then they started crying, and my aunt as well, as I told you, she lives in a refugee camp in Jordan right now, and they were crying. So the memory is bad. I must tell you that. I mean, it's a bad memory about things that happened, and then they told me what happened before 1948, and then when they left, they took the keys, and they never thought that they would never be allowed to go back. Before 1970, they used to live in the Nusayrat refugee camp. So when they moved from the refugee camp to Gaza City itself, that was after 1967. Of course, before 1967, they were not allowed. They were only allowed to visit Zarnuga between 1967 and 1993. And because during the first Intifada, it was also very, very difficult. And the memories they had, of course, they had very nice memories about, Zarnuga before 1948. But then what happened exactly in 1948, they wouldn't tell us in detail. I mean, they would tell us the stories because it's a trauma.
Yeah,
it's a real trauma, and it has become part of our collective unconscious. You know that, all of us Palestinians. But for me, Zarnuga has a special place, in my heart. So they told me about the mosque, and they told me about streets, and my father had good memories of the coffee shop. Where they used to sit, etc., etc. But he used to work, he used to work in Yafa and other places, not in Zarnuga, as a young man. I mean, talking to you, knowing that you are in Zarnuga now, and watching that video you've just sent, it's very emotional. because it brings back the memories of both parents who died. My father died in January 2005. My mother couldn't bear it, and then she followed him in May 2005. So it's only 4 months between the death of my father and the death of my mother. The sad part of it is that my mother was very ill at the end of her life, and she would wake up, she would lose consciousness, she would wake up, and that is after the death of my father. And then she would ask my brother whether my father has come back from Yafa or not, which means, now she thought that she was still, and that was in 2005, which means that she ignored about 60 years of dispossession, Nakba, and she believed that she was still in Zarnuga. And she was waiting for Hafiz, that's my father, to, he was working in Yafa, and she was waiting for him to come back from Yafa. And then she would ask my brother, Abu Raja, and, is he back? Is he back from Yafa? It's sad, actually. It's sad, but at the same time, I say, thank goodness that both died, before the 3 genocidal wars Israel launched on Gaza to finish, quote unquote, to finish the job that they didn't see. I really didn't want them to see that. I didn't want them to go through this, what our friend, mine and yours friend, Ilan, calls incremental genocide that, that has been imposed on Gaza since 2006. And so they left Zarnuga in order to live on the largest concentration camp on earth. So what is only left for us now is what you are telling me. What is only left is, the mosque and that area you are talking about. I'm dying to see it, definitely in person. We will have that. I really have no doubt in my mind whatsoever, I will invite you to Zarnuga, definitely. And then we will start remembering this moment. And you remember, Neta, when I was in Gaza and I couldn't visit Zarnuga? That moment is coming, whether Netanyahu wants that or he doesn't want that. We are not waiting for him to say yes. What we have on our side is our light. We are talking to each other as human beings. You are our comrades in arms, we refuse to have any joint projects with Israelis unless they recognize our right of return, and unless this project comes as part of co-resistance. After an hour, I will go to the eastern fence of Gaza. I will be joined by tens of thousands of refugees who will be marching at the fence, demanding the implementation of United Nations Resolution 194 and believing firmly that it will happen.
We are here a group of activists, BDS activists and activists who have decided to join the Great March of Return. We are here because we want the implementation of United Nations Resolution 194, which calls for the return of all Palestinian refugees to the towns and villages from which they were ethnically cleansed back in 1948. We can see you from this side, but we cannot shake hands with you. We can see you raising the Palestinian flag. You're about 300 to 400 meters from the fence, from where we are standing, but we cannot talk to you. We cannot shake hands with you, and this is apartheid.
We are believing very strongly that one day we will get rid of this fence, the same way Germans managed to bring down the Berlin Wall, and the same way Black South Africans managed, with the help and the support of conscientious people all over the world, to bring down the apartheid system. Where is apartheid now? It is in the dustbin of history. And the day will come when we go to visit that museum in Jerusalem, and similar to the Museum of Apartheid that people are visiting right now in Johannesburg, and we will look at Zionism and remnants of Zionism and see, well, people didn't know that one day Zionism will only be visited in the museum or in the dustbin of history. We are feeling right now in Palestine, and especially in Gaza, that we are living our South African moment. The moment that, you know, the darkest moment of the night that precedes, that comes before the dawn. And you have an open invitation to visit Zarnuga when I go back to Zarnuga.
I don't know how you manage to, you know, always from the darkest place, you know, and in the situation that I know you're living in right now, like, to always give me hope, you know, and give us hope, and you convince me that that we have to keep going and we have to keep fighting because this injustice will come to an end.
We will be equal citizens in a secular democratic state very soon, Netta.
Amen. Yeah, I'm so looking forward.
Inshallah.
Ho, 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 ho. Ho, 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 ho. Ho, 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 ho. Ho, 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 ho. بين المخاض والألم من تاني بنتولد بين المخاض والألم الحكمة بتتولد والغنوة بتتولد كل اللي عدى وراح لسه في عينيك بيتولد هو 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 هو.
That was quite a riveting documentary, Professor Haidar. It's, I mean, 2019, 2024, you could have had that conversation yesterday. In other news, not unrelated, the ICC issued a warrant of arrest for Netanyahu, former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and a senior Israeli member. And I think, you know, of course, we know the ICC can't guarantee arrest, but hopefully this will limit the movements that Netanyahu makes when he visits other member states. Of course, America, the US, is not a member of the ICC, so he can move freely over there. And then, of course, the response from his office was that he said the warrants was absurd and anti-Semitic. And I think it's quite important that we engage on this issue of anti-Semitism, because it seems to be a general kind of defense and blanket for everything you do that is vocal and critical of Israeli Zionism. And I think the important distinction for me there is to say, you know, is it anti-Semitic or is it anti-Zionist? And if you can make that distinction, of course, it's an important one to make, and it's an important one to advance as well. I know that there is currently a case in the Equality Court against an influencer, South African influencer, Harris Jakut, where you know, the audacity, the gumption, the gall of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. I mean, they are the ones who are taking Jakut Harris to the Equality Court. So they are using the very mechanisms that was employed to advance equality in a liberal and free South Africa for everyone. They are now using that to further advance acts of Zionism and to show the South African public that if you speak up and if you speak out about the war in Gaza, if you say anything against Netanyahu, even though we live in the southernmost tip of Africa, they are here. And I think this is why we need to amplify our solidarity, because the Israelis have amplified their Zionist efforts to counter everything that gets said about Israel. So the next item will be the introduction of the speaker, and I'll hand over to Dr. Paulette Kutsia.
Hi, everyone. I'm very honored to have been given this task of introducing Haidar Eid today. Professor Haidar Eid, author of the book Decolonising the Palestinian Mind, scholar and teacher of post-colonial and world literature and critical theory, musician, and activist for Palestinian freedom and for global justice and human rights everywhere. Dual Palestinian and South African citizen. Haidar was born in Nusayrat refugee camp in Gaza after his parents were forcibly displaced from their ancestral home in the village of Zarnuqa during the Nakba of 1948, when their land was seized by the Zionists with the backing of Western powers in the violent colonial attacks on Palestinians that established the settler colonial state of modern-day Israel. And of course, we've just been watching that very moving documentary. At the beginning of the current genocide on Gaza that has been ongoing since October last year, Haidar, his wife, and 2 little daughters experienced and witnessed a second Nakba, subjected to bombing and multiple forced displacements before they accepted our government's offer of evacuation and arrived in South Africa following harrowing journeys in December 2023. Haidar has suffered unimaginable losses in the past year. I had said more than 40, but of course I've just heard that it's over 50 of his close relatives. Many of his academic colleagues, students, and friends have been murdered by Israel's IDF and their Western sponsors and enablers. He has spoken in interviews about suffering survivors' guilt and feeling conflicted about his decision to leave. As I'm sure you are all aware, the official death count of over 42,000 people, or 45,000, as Prof said, most of them women and children in Gaza, is hugely understated, as many more, tens of thousands, are unaccounted for, and their dead bodies likely to be lying crushed under the rubble of their destroyed houses, schools, mosques, churches, and apartment buildings. This is not to mention the hundreds of thousands of physically and mentally wounded and bereaved survivors. And even if, please God, there were to be today the ceasefire we are all calling for, vetoed once again this week by the United States at the UN Security Council, there would be nowhere safe for Haidar and his family to return to in their beloved city, since over 70% of the buildings have been destroyed. Haidar completed his BA and MA degrees at the Eastern Mediterranean University in Northern Cyprus, and then he did his PhD at the University of Johannesburg, awarded in 2000 for his thesis titled Worlding Postmodernism, Interpretive Possibilities of Critical Theory. I was very excited to discover that he and I share a PhD supervisor for our degrees, mine awarded 15 years later at Rhodes University, in Professor Mike Murray, which I think means that we share an academic kinship of a special kind. And Mike, if you're listening, thank you. When I read Haidar's acknowledgement of your constructive and painstaking criticisms, I knew exactly what he meant. Over his academic career, Professor Eid has taught at a number of different universities in South Africa, China, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. He then returned to Palestine to teach at Al-Aqsa University in Gaza, where he is Associate Professor of Post-Colonial and Postmodern Literature. As he describes it in a recent interview, Al-Aqsa University has 30,000 students, and it had 2 beautiful campuses. they have now been totally destroyed in the scholasticide that forms part of Israel's genocide, along with all Gaza's other universities, schools, and colleges. In 1996, the late scholar Bill Reddings published a book called The University in Ruins, in which he analyzed the decline of modernist conceptions of universities in the West and their replacement by the emptiness of what he called the University of Excellence, a bureaucratic structure essentially devoid of meaning that he argued had come to dominate Western higher education in the era of globalization. Redding's title is, of course, metaphorical. The ruined university he refers to is perfectly solid and secure in its spatial, material foundations. By painful, ironic contrast, Al-Aqsa University lives on in the minds and work of its scholars and students, though its spatial infrastructure has been obliterated, and so many of its people have been murdered in the genocide. Haidar says that, as Palestinians, despair is a luxury that we cannot afford at all. In the midst of so much carnage, destruction, and suffering, his is an ethical, intellectual, and political voice that refuses to be silenced, and that insists in looking back to understand the historical roots of this current moment, as well as looking forward with insistent and resistant hope to work to create and implement his vision of, and I quote, one secular democratic state in historic Palestine in which all citizens are treated equally regardless of their religion, gender, and color. It is my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce our speaker, Professor Haidar Eid.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, before I start, I just need to warn you. I was asked about, one thing in common that we have with South Africans, Palestinians and South Africans, and I said, Palestinians and South Africans are talkative. So if I talk a lot, you need to stop me. And it happens that I am both Palestinian and South African as well. So if you are giving me 15 minutes, I think you will allow me to talk for 30 minutes. Right, yeah. But let me start by acknowledging Professor Keith, of course, and I would really like to thank you for this generous and kind invitation, Dr. Paulette, Tasneem, and I would have loved to acknowledge every single person sitting here today with us. I really appreciate that a lot. And I would have loved to acknowledge every single South African for what the step that has been taken by the South African government by daring to take on apartheid Israel, taking apartheid Israel to the ICJ. Of course, I would say thank you to every single South African, with the exception of those who voted for pro-Israeli parties, of course. I wouldn't say thank you. I was thinking of starting this by reading, part of the introduction of the book, but I will do that later on. But I want to start not by talking about my book. I have promised all my comrades in Palestine, in Gaza, activists in the BDS movement and in the One State campaign, that whenever I conduct an interview, whenever I talk about my book, I should start by talking about Gaza. Because for me, and I believe for the overwhelming majority of people here in South Africa and in the global South, Gaza is the center of the universe. And I will elaborate. I will elaborate by telling you about my personal experience. In fact, this book was supposed to be published before the 7th of October. But then when 7th of October took place, the publisher contacted me and he asked me to add the prologue that we have in the book right now about my personal experience. In South Africa, this is my 4th displacement over the last year. The first time I was displaced after my apartment was destroyed, and I lost my apartment, I lost my car, and I left the apartment together with my family, my 2 daughters, and my wife, wearing my T-shirt and slippers, in fact, because I never thought that we wouldn't be allowed to go back. And I spent that night, which so far has been the most horrific night of my life. I spent it with my neighbors and with my 2 little daughters and wife, and that was the night when I lost my hearing because of the severity of the bombing, and I needed to protect my little child, so I closed her ears. So then we were displaced to the north. I stayed with my brother, and 3 days after that, the same scenario was repeated. And I moved to the south, where I stayed for 2 months in Rafah with my sister until the South African embassy contacted us, and we were allowed to leave. So that's my experience. I don't want to tell you about the details of what we saw in those 2 months. But I want to take you back, because people keep asking me, I mean, why Gaza? Why are you saying Gaza is the center of the universe? Why is Israel targeting especially Gaza? I mean, they attack the West Bank every now and then. They attack Jenin, they attack Tulkarem, they attack Al Khalil. People who've been to Palestine know what I'm talking about. But why Gaza? Gaza, most people don't know that 80% of Gazans are refugees entitled to their right of return in accordance with United Nations Resolution 194. In other words, Gazans keep reminding Israel of the original sin that took place in 1948. Not in 1967, in 1948. You cannot solve the Palestinian question without granting us our right of return, as you saw in the documentary. In January 2006, we were asked, after the destruction of Iraq, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when George Bush, those of you who remember George Bush, the son, Jr., he wanted to spread democracy in the Middle East, classical colonialist ideology. So he wanted to start by asking the poor Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to head to the polling stations and voting for their representatives in the Legislative Council. Only Palestinians of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. That is to say, 1/3 of the Palestinian people. So people naively went to the polling stations and voted. And when they voted against the will of the Americans, against the will of the Israelis. They voted against the 2-state solution. They voted against the Oslo Accords. They voted against the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. And that was a surprise. And therefore, apartheid Israel decided to punish Palestinians in the West Bank, but especially in Gaza, because Palestinians of Gaza, in other words, supported resistance. Resistance in all of its forms. You in South Africa were talking about 4 pillars of struggle, not only 1 pillar, 4 pillars of struggle. In Palestine, we have tried everything. Everything. Civil disobedience, popular resistance, armed resistance, BDS, sanctions, etc., etc. So far, nothing has worked. And because we voted against the racist 2-state solution, apartheid Israel, in cahoot with the United States of America and reactionary Arab regimes, decided to impose a deadly medieval siege on Gaza. 2.3 million. And I remember, that was in 2006. I remember there were times when I couldn't find milk for our kids. We couldn't find fuel for our cars. 96% of Gaza water became undrinkable. We couldn't find medicine. All kinds of medicine we couldn't find. And people started dying. That was back in 2006. And as if that was not enough, because people of Gaza decided to fight back, apartheid Israel, on the 27th of December 2008, I remember exactly, 11:15 a.m. I was driving my car, and I had just passed by the main police, the headquarters of the police in Gaza. 10 minutes after that, Israel started a massive aerial attack from Rafah in the south to Beit Hanun in the north, within 3 minutes killing 240 people, including the main police station. Had I been late 10 minutes, I would have died. And I'm talking to you right now, and I'm saying this as a fact. I know very well that I'm supposed to be dead. And again, as I said yesterday, I'm not trying here to use emotive language. It's a fact. And I'm supposed to be dead not because of what happened in 2008, but because of what is happening right now in Gaza, and I will explain. So for 18 days at the time, apartheid Israel killed more than 1,200 people, including 434 children, including 200 women, innocent people. 90% of those who got killed were civilians. And what did the international community do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Israel committed war crimes and crimes against humanity at that time. The United Nations sent a commission of investigation headed by none other than the respected South African judge, Goldstone. And they concluded that Israel is guilty of committing war crimes and possible crimes against humanity. The world did absolutely nothing at that time. And therefore, apartheid Israel decided to do the same thing in 2012, attacking Gaza for a week. And again, I was driving my car from the Khan Yunis campus to the Gaza campus, and I heard the bombing. And of course, I reached home and decided not to leave because you couldn't walk in the streets, otherwise you would be targeted. For a week, killing more than 200 people, including 64 children. I remember the figures. I don't like figures and numbers, because every and each one of them had dreams, had ambitions. But I can't mention all the names. Did the world do anything at the time? No. In fact, they blamed both sides, the colonizer and the colonized, the oppressor and the oppressed. And I remember at the time, a South African radio station calling me, and I remember the presenter saying, surely Israel has the right to defend itself. And my answer was, did apartheid have the right to defend itself against the blacks of South Africa? Does settler colonialism have the right to defend itself? Defend itself against whom? Against now more than 17,000 children who got killed within a year? I mean, that's a question to be raised. 2012 was not enough. And because the world decided to blame both sides, apartheid Israel felt with full impunity that it could come back and attack Gaza again in 2014 for 51 days. 51 days. I was there. And I remember very well the South African embassy in Ramallah contacting me. I said, if you want to leave, we can organize that. And I said, no, I don't want to. I didn't have kids at that time. And I refused to leave. Thank you. And I refused to leave. because I believe that, I should stay. That's part of our, what we call in Arabic, sumud. Steadfastness. And I refused to leave. For 51 days, apartheid Israel killed 2,400 people. The overwhelming majority of whom were civilians. So we expected the democratic West to do something. I mean, in the late 80s, they decided to boycott the apartheid regime of South Africa. So it's time now for the world to boycott apartheid Israel. No, we were boycotted. Sanctions were imposed upon us, Gaza, and the West Bank. And this is why we decided to start our Great March of Return, which you saw in this documentary. And I was there. Almost every single Friday, I would join together with my late friend, former student, Khalil Abu Yahya, who filmed this documentary. He was my former student, an ex-student of mine, and he was a BDS activist, and his wife also was a student of mine. And then we expected the world to do something, targeting youngsters and children, amputated legs and arms. Nothing worked. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Gaza remained under siege, a deadly hermetic siege, medieval siege, unprecedented siege. And then in 2021, they attacked Gaza for 5 days, killing more than 100 people. And this is why, this is the context leading to the 7th of October. Nothing is working. Nothing. And I didn't take you back to 1948. I didn't take you back to 1967. But I'm just telling you about my personal experience. My personal experience. All the massacres committed against the people of Gaza since 2006, including the March of Return, nothing worked. Palestinian civil society back in 2005, we've learned. I mean, myself and Professor Keith, we were together in 2001 in Durban. And I remember the NGOs Forum issuing a statement at the end of the conference, calling Israel an apartheid state. Then Human Rights Watch issued a report calling Israel an apartheid state. United Nations report, ESQA, issued a statement calling Israel an apartheid state. Then Amnesty International called Israel an apartheid state. Then B'Tselem, Israel's mainstream human rights organization, said the regime between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean is an apartheid regime. How do you deal with apartheid? The West welcomed apartheid, in fact. They praised apartheid. They welcomed with open arms war criminals. And because of that, after the 7th of October, apartheid Israel thought that there is one more crime that Israel had not committed very openly yet, the crime of genocide. The gravest crime against humanity. And this is what is happening right now in Gaza. If I talk too much, you can stop me. All right. So far, again, let me go back to figures. And again, as I said, I don't like to talk about figures. And I myself, when I talk about figures, because I remember Khalil, his wife Tasneem, their 2 little angels. And I remember more than 55 of my own cousins. And I'm talking about whole families. Whole families were wiped out. Wiped out. And people who visit Palestine know when we talk about Palestinian families, we are not talking about, Western nuclear families. We're talking about 7 or, 8 brothers and sisters. And then they would say, wow, it's too small. Yeah, that's a small family. Why only 8? Why not 20? Yeah, and those families would be wiped out. I'm talking about thousands of families. So far, according to figures issued by Ministry of Health in Gaza, 43,000 people have been killed over the last year. including 17,000 children and 12,000 women. Let's think about this in South African terms. It's like killing 4 million South Africans within a year, killing 20 million Americans within a year. And America is saying, no, 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 that's not genocide. So what is genocide? Scholars of genocide called it genocide. It's not only Palestinian human rights organizations. The South African government is calling it genocide. The Global South, from Brazil to Nicaragua, to Venezuela, to Cuba, are calling it genocide. And I tell you, I used to be more hopeful. And again, despair is not an option. But it's been 13 months now. 13 months. BDS is not working. Well, working, but very slowly. ICJ is not working. Popular resistance is not working. Yesterday, when I was interviewed by my sister and my brother, I got a message about one of my best friend's sons, and I have been trying to get hold of him just to say how sorry I am. His little son, I love his son. He was like my own son, studying engineering, bright, brilliant, handsome boy, 20 years old. He was killed, he was targeted. And I found out just today in the morning, he was trying to get a signal on the roof. And he was targeted while he was trying to call his father in the south. He hasn't seen his father and his mother for a year. His father and mother left Gaza City, moved to the south, and he was left there to look after the house. And they couldn't see him for a year. He's gone, just like that. Khalil Abu Yahya, who filmed that documentary, I was speaking to him only 3 hours before he was targeted. And again, I'm not trying to raise your emotions and use emotion. No, something needs to be done. I know very well that my family is being starved now. There's no food. There's no food. No food in the north, in Beit Lahia, no food in Jabalia, no food in Gaza City, and no food in the south where my family is staying right now. And they are being starved to death. And the world is watching. You know, streamed live. Everybody can. You can just turn on your mobile phone, your Facebook, and then you can watch the genocide taking place live. Live. So what are we going to do about this? How can we stop it? How can we understand Gaza? My next book is about Gaza. It's going to be published in May. And I forced myself to write it. I forced myself because I love Edward Said. And Edward Said told us that we have to write our story, the Palestinian narrative. And if we don't do that, we will disappear. We will disappear. So we are writing our narratives, and we are resisting. Every single day, you hear about resistance. In 2005, Palestinian civil society issued a statement, learning from South Africa. Learning, I mean, there are lessons to learn from South Africa and from your mistakes and from your sacrifices. And this is part of the book, Lessons Learned from South Africa. We looked at South Africa in the late 50s. A handful of BDS activists, ANC, SACP activists, issued a statement from London calling on the international community to boycott the apartheid regime until it complies with international law. Very, very clear. How long did it take the international community to heed the call made by the oppressed of South Africa? More than 30 years. Mind you, and I'm sure you remember very well, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher called Mandela a terrorist. The ANC was a terrorist organization. Now everybody is celebrating South African freedom. And I think now it's time to boycott apartheid and not only boycott apartheid, because many conscientious people have already started boycotting apartheid Israel, divesting from Israel and from international companies benefiting from Israel's violations of our human rights. Our basic, by the way, what are we calling for? We're calling for our basic rights: freedom, equality, justice, and that is called anti-Semitism. You know, when you call for equality, I remember very well, I was giving a talk like this in Scotland, and a Zionist, and I hope we don't have Zionists here, a Zionist stood up and he said, well, I understand when you call for freedom, it's your right. And I understand when you call for right of return, but I can't imagine you calling for equality. Because that means the end of Israel as the state of Jews. And he's right. I know, I mean, it's shocking, but he's right. Because Israel defines itself as the state of Jews only. Israel does not define itself as the state of its citizens. And this is why, Paulette, I call for a secular democratic state, because that is the antithesis of Zionism. I mean, a state for all, and by the way, allow me to say this, it's a huge compromise that we, colonized Palestinians, natives, are offering equal citizenship to the colonizer. To the colonizer who accepts to abandon his colonial privileges. And then that would lead to what my comrade and friend Omar Barghouti calls ethical decolonization. Ethical decolonizations. You made mistakes in South Africa. We are learning from that. And Professor Keith mentioned Frantz Fanon. Definitely this book is inspired, the ideas are inspired by the ideas of Frantz Fanon. Pitfalls of national consciousness, hence my critique of Palestinian nationalism. Palestinian nationalism as defined the Palestinian bourgeoisie, the official leadership of the PLO, that ultimately decided to sign the Oslo Accords. I'm talking about the book now. Ultimately decided to sign the Oslo Accords, giving up on our basic rights, including right of return and right to equality. This book has also been inspired by the works of Edward Said, definitely, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa. Today I was having a discussion with Comrade Anver here about the works of Neville Alexander. And yes, definitely I have been inspired by their works, but I would say I definitely have been inspired since my childhood by the late Palestinian writer Ghassan Kanafani. Those of you who are familiar with Palestinian literature, Ghassan Kanafani has inspired every single idea that I have been defending since I've started thinking about the liberation of Palestine. Thank you so much for listening to me.
I actually lost track of time. You could have taken another half an hour, honestly. Nobody would have objected. Thank you so much, Professor Haidar. That was very enlightening and very insightful. I mean, I think as activists, we think, you know, we know it all, but I think you can never know it all. So we're going to be doing open floor questions and answers now, so I'm happy to open the floor to anyone who wants to ask a question. Okay. Okay. Professor, you would have heard Professor Haidar say that he lost his hearing was it in October or December? October, when the bombs were going off. And did you hold Salma's ear or Haifa's ears? Because she wouldn't hold her own. And as a consequence, he lost 90% of hearing. So if we can maybe, he is very good at lip reading. He did tell us that. So If you ask the question, just be loud and clear and not so fast. So, anyone? Okay, someone.
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you for your presentation. I want to latch on to this idea of equality. And I think in South Africa, as South Africans went through the process of truth and reconciliation, as we witness our suburbs, our communities integrated, people standing in queues together, we were made to feel appreciative that we were given an equal right to the colonizer. But if you've visited Palestine, if you are Palestinian, if you have witnessed the atrocities, the genocide, the inequality, it is difficult to imagine. I mean, we are idealizing about liberation and equality when it's at this stage seems so far-fetched. But I cannot imagine, or I struggle to imagine, a society wherein Palestinians and Israelis are capable of living together. On the one end, there is a generational brainwashing of Israelis to feel themselves entitled, God's chosen people. And the sheer pain that Palestinians carry generationally from dispossession, murder, genocide, it seems somewhat impossible to achieve. And I think whilst despair is not an option, hope must live, even if a flicker of hope. We speak of the future of a Palestinian-Israeli secular state. Now, how do you imagine that state to survive the trauma that it has endured? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, very, very good question, actually. Let's go back. Of course, in South Africa, you know, there was one form of oppression, you know, and this is not to underestimate apartheid. And I agree with you. In fact, in this answer, I tend to agree with what you are saying about the difficulties of achieving, you know, equality and a secular democratic state in Palestine. In Palestine, you have a multi-tiered system of oppression. The direct occupation, military occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which is, of course, which comes in violation of international law. But we are expecting Donald Trump to recognize Israel's right to annex the West Bank. And I will remind you of that. And then you have, you know, more than 1.4 million Palestinian third-class citizens of Israel. So in other words, you have apartheid within Israel itself. The third thing is that you have, you know, an ongoing process of ethnic cleansing. Again, against international law, and our right of return is guaranteed under international law according to United Nations Resolution 194. And this is the reason why, when we issued our BDS call in 2005, we decided not to endorse a political solution for the reasons that you are mentioning right now. Notice the BDS movement is a rights-based movement. We are calling on the international community to boycott apartheid Israel, divest from Israel, impose sanctions against Israel until it complies with international law. Now, the question then that I myself, together with a group of academics, activists, decided to raise, but what is the political vision? Now, we grant you your rights, but your rights must come within a political vision. The only solution that has been supported by the so-called international community, the colonial West. People say international community to mean the colonial West. unfortunately, is the so-called two-state solution. But the two-state solution is a racist solution, because you are separating between people based on their ethno-religious identity. That's number one. Number two, even if you are allowed as a Palestinian to establish a state on 22% of historic Palestine, that is to say the West Bank and Gaza Strip and Eastern Jerusalem. You've been to the West Bank. Where in the West Bank can you establish an independent state? 42% of the West Bank has been expropriated and next to the existing settlements. The number of settlers, Jewish settlers, of course, settlers in Palestine are only Jewish. This is not anti-Semitic. Yeah, all right. Now we have to be careful. Yeah. The number of settlers, look at this. In 1993, when Israel, led by the dovish government of the Labour Party, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres at that time, the number of settlers when they signed the Oslo Accords was 193,000 in Gaza and the West Bank. We Palestinians, our leadership at that time, believed that the Israelis would grant the Palestinians an independent state in 1999, 6 years after the signing of the Oslo Accords. What is the number of Jewish settlers now in the West Bank alone? 800,000. 800,000. Where are they going to go if you have an independent Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank? So what do I mean? What I mean is that it's impossible to have an independent state. And this is why my argument based on Fanon and Said is not independence, but liberation. Liberation. Because the two-state solution solves the problem of 1/3 of the Palestinian people. What about 1.4 million Palestinians living in Israel? What about 5 million Palestinian refugees living in the diaspora? How does the two-state solution solve their problem? It doesn't. There is no answer. So what's the alternative? If not a secular democratic state, and notice, I said it is conditioned on the fact that the colonizer has to abandon all colonial privileges. Without that, you cannot have equality. You cannot have a secular democratic state. And this is why people kept asking us, you know, Edward Said called the Oslo Accords Versailles treason, called the Palestinian Authority the Vichy government, all right? Then people started saying, so what's your alternative? You're criticizing, what's your alternative? He wrote a piece in 1997 in Al-Ahram Weekly titled A Secular Solution. A secular solution, calling for a secular democratic state. Now, do we have the details? Do we have a constitution of that secular democratic state? No, we don't. But I'll tell you, I mean, South Africa, you have one of the most progressive constitutions on earth. I've read it, all right? And I think it's something to learn from. Again, equality is the antithesis of Zionism. The moment you have equality between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, that means the beginning of the end of settler colonialism. Israel as an apartheid entity in Palestine. And I think, seriously, yes, I've been talking about genocide, and what I said sounded very, very pessimistic, but it was, I think, Gramsci who talked about the pessimism of the will and the optimism of the intellect. And I think it is our role to try to find alternatives. And I am open if you have a third alternative. Right? We agreed the two-state solution is impossible. I said the alternative is secular democracy. If you have a third or a fourth or a fifth alternative, I am very open to listen.
Keep that one.
Okay.
There's a question at the back, Dr. Janitri, I recognize you, and Ruby, just Ruby, before you, Dr. Janet, she just had her hand up. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Your presentation was really enlightening. Mr. Stan, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so my mind is also around this equality that you're speaking about. And I'm thinking about South Africa and how things have evolved with inequality deepening within our country. And you mentioned that the secular state can only come about when the colonizer gives up its privileges. I would like you to maybe expand on that, because essentially, if one looks at South Africa, the economic power is still very much within the hands of a few. And so, if one looks at the dispossession of the Palestinians, and there might be a move towards a secular state, how will that dispossessed population achieve economic equality? And I'm not talking about the political aspect, but really socio-economic equality within the envisaged secular state. Yeah. Thanks.
No, that's an excellent question. I will send you, I will email you a piece that I co-authored with an American researcher whose field of study is apartheid in South Africa and apartheid in Palestine, addressing that question. But, I will remember to do that. But, I completely agree with you. I said that, this book was inspired by the works of Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, etc., etc. And one of my favorite chapters in The Richard of the Earth is the pitfalls of national consciousness. Pitfalls, I'm not sure people who are familiar know what I'm talking about. That, the transfer of power from, white hands to black hands without serious and real change. Yeah. So yes, I agree with you about that. Yeah. But I think when I talked about, abandoning colonial privileges, this was based on the fact that Israel, defines itself as the state of Jews only. Now, this is their basic law. They have hundreds of basic laws. In 2017, the Israeli Knesset parliament voted for what they called the nation-state law. How do you define Israel? Well, Israel defines itself literally as the state of Jews only. Okay, what do you mean by Jews? I mean, who's Jew? Who's not Jew? Well, every single person born to a Jewish mother is automatically entitled to Israeli citizenship. So if you were born to a Jewish mother in Cape Town, or Sri Lanka, or Alaska, you are granted Israeli citizenship upon arrival in Israel. I was born in Palestine. My parents were born in Palestine, and I trace, my origin back to I don't know which century. No, I don't have that privilege. And that is exactly what I mean. That's that. And then the other basic laws, more than 60 basic laws in apartheid Israel, define Israel as an apartheid state. Every single apartheid law you had here in South Africa has an equivalent in Israel. And now, as I said, I mean, the antithesis was, definitely equality, political equality. You made mistakes, and definitely we need to learn from that about socioeconomic, privileges, etc., etc. I completely agree with you, and this is why I am a reader of theories of racial capitalism. I mean, I had this discussion in the morning with Comrade Anwar. Yeah.
Thanks. Dr. Janet?
Thank you, Haidar. And just to say, when you speak of a single secular state, it sounds like the voice of reason to me, but unfortunately, our government, the ANC government, has supported the position of a two-state solution. And I want to pose a question to all of us. Like, I heard your frustration in saying, like, we've tried everything. What is going to bring this to an end? It's not the international courts. It's not there's no effective sanctions, etc. So to say, what can we do to change the narrative, to change the accepted position, firstly, of our government, which is our own government, accountable to us, and secondly, how can we implement effective BDS strategy? And that effective BDS strategy, I think we need to look beyond, whether you buy cosmetics or something, which is not going to have any impact on anybody. We have to look at the key of the economy, which is energy. So South Africa sells coal to Israel. I hope everybody knows that. We trade in coal to Israel. Do you hear that? And people understand the corruption in the coal industry and Eskom and so on. So that is one point. The other is we sell diamonds to Israel, and we trade in electronic equipment, which is used for various purposes. I don't know the details of that. I heard a debate the other day about weapons and whether we trade in weapons to other countries, which then don't produce an end-user certificate, but allow them then to be used in other conflict zones in the world. So these are, I think, the sort of points of pressure that we need to try and press on. But I would really welcome some input from you as to what we should be doing.
All right. So there are 2 points here about BDS and the one-state solution. But the fact that the ANC government still supports the two-state solution, and it boggles my mind, to tell you the truth, that post-apartheid South Africa supports a racist solution. And I shared platforms, you remember, I shared platforms with Dr. Nelady, and then after the legal team came back to South Africa from the ICJ, I also shared platform with the legal team, and we had the Minister of Justice, who is the DIRCO minister right now, and I raised the same question. The same question. I mean, you cannot have two states in Palestine. Everybody knows this. Behind the scene, when you talk to Palestinian politicians who would sacrifice their lives for the two-state solution, would tell you it's impossible. It's impossible to have an independent Palestinian state for the reasons I've just mentioned. Now, there seems to be, a so-called international consensus about the two-state solution, because you keep promising the Palestinians that they will have their own state, but they have to be patient a little bit. In 1993, when the Palestinian leadership, when I say the Palestinian leadership, I mean the Palestine Liberation Organization, headed by Fatah and its leader Yasser Arafat, the late Yasser Arafat at that time, they decided to recognize Israel's right to exist. To me, it's strange that some states, call for my right to exist. States exist, definitely. Leading to the so-called, two-state solution. It took Yasser Arafat exactly 7 years to realize that it's not going to happen. It's not going to. In 2000, he went to Camp David to have the so-called final status negotiations. Final status negotiations, how do you solve the Palestinian refugees issue and the 1948 issue and the establishment of a state with Jerusalem as its capital. And he found out that it was a farce. It was a farce. And this is why he decided to boycott negotiations, and this is why he was killed. Poisoned in Ramallah 3 years after that, if you remember. I'm sure you remember. So yeah, two states, it is impossible. So why does the South African government, why does it still support the two-state solution? I tell you what answer they give us. They say this is what your leadership is calling for. The Palestinian Authority is calling for the two-state solution. And Arab world is calling for the two-state solution. Why do you expect us to support other solutions? Well, my answer is that because you have to be principled. Because post-apartheid South Africa cannot support an apartheid solution. So I personally think we need to engage them, to challenge them. And I tell you, if you remember Tasneem that night, when we shared the platform with Nelady, she said, I agree with everything you said. You remember that? Yes. Yeah, and I said, well, again, the one-state solution. I cannot imagine any other solution, honestly. And if you want to avoid the 1-2 state, it's not a dichotomy, false dichotomy, let me call it. Rights. grant us our rights. Right, freedom, Gaza and the West Bank, right of return, and right to equality. And this is why the slogans coming now to BDS, the slogans of the BDS movement, freedom, equality, justice. Justice meaning here, return of Palestinian refugees and compensation, because some people, lawyers know this better, I'm sure, they say return or compensation. No, it is return and compensation. Now, BDS is a tool of struggle. People kept asking us, especially after the Durban conference, okay, we want to show solidarity with the Palestinian people. We will send delegations to Palestine, but then after we come back home, what do you want us to do? And then we looked at the first statement issued by South Africans in the late 50s, which calling for BDS, and it was given a boost after the Sharpeville massacre, 1961, I think? 1961, after the Sharpeville massacre. And we based our statement, I am one of the co-founders of the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Our PAC-B, academic and cultural boycott statement, came out before the BDS call in 2004. We called on academic institutions, I know you know that, cultural figures and cultural institutions to boycott Israeli academic and cultural institutions at the time for their complicity in Israel's violations of human rights. Now, I can tell you as an academic, for their involvement, direct involvement in the crimes committed against us, what remains of us Palestinian academics in Gaza. 11 academic institutions have been totally destroyed, including 9 universities. My own university is one of them. More than 600 schools, including my kids' schools, have, as part of what the Palestinian scholar Karman Nabulsi calls scholasticized, the deliberate targeting of academic institutions. What do we want from you as BDS? We want all South African universities to cut all academic, research, and cultural ties with a civil society here, a civil society. If your government doesn't want to cut diplomatic ties, which is extremely shameful, with the only apartheid regime that we still have in the Middle East, that's shameful. But you as civil society, I'm sure you are familiar with the Stellenbosch University statement. That's shameful, actually, statement, refusing to put an end to academic ties with Israeli institutions. This is what we want from you. Now, with the genocide, we want more. Do you know that South Africa is the 3rd exporter of coal to apartheid Israel? In other words, enabling the genocide. Colombia #1, Russia #2, South Africa #3. Colombia decided to stop exporting coal to apartheid Israel. So now we have Russia and South Africa. So what are you going to do about this? Now this question is addressed to you as South Africans, not to me. How are you going to allow that to happen? Look, my hope was that to make Palestine a domestic issue in South Africa. And I think with our comrades here, we have managed to do that. People went to the polling station, I think it was in May, and I've met so many South Africans who told me, we are voting for Palestine. We are voting for Palestine. We've managed to make Palestine a South African issue, as domestic issue. And I think you need to go ahead with that.
Thank you. We still have time for, well, we're supposed to wrap up at 10 to, but even if we go until 6, there's a question. There are 2 questions. So are you getting tired? Yeah. Okay, is there a mic for the, yeah.
Thank you. I just want to ask, in your, sorry, that, okay. Yes, you said that you are convinced that two-state solution will not work So what makes you think that equality will work? What makes you think that Israel will ever agree to give Palestinians equal rights?
Resistance. Resistance. I mean, no, in Algeria, they did not go to the settlers and said, please, French settlers, give us our freedom, give us equality, give us justice. No, they had to fight. In South Africa, you didn't beg, actually, for your freedom. I mean, 4 pillars of struggle. You turned black townships into ungovernable spaces. Armed struggle. Nelson Mandela, actually, was accused of sabotage. Armed struggle. 2, underground. 3, mobilization, mass mobilization. 4, international solidarity movement and BDS. This is what is going to force Israel. And right now in Israel, why do you think they haven't been able to reoccupy Gaza for the last year? After killing, and by the way, according to the reputable medical journal, The Lancet, the figure is not 43,000, 186,000 until June this year. 186,000. And apartheid Israel, genocidal Israel, has not been able to reoccupy the Gaza Strip yet. Why?
Resistance.
It's resistance. Resistance. We will not go and, beg them for our freedom, for equality, for justice. No, we will coerce them. And this is why, as Palestinian civil society, we called for BDS. Because if you want to support Palestinians, this is what we want. We want you to heed our call. And I know majority of South African civil society has decided to heed our call, definitely. But there is one thing, and I'm saying this as a comrade, as also a South African. Palestinian cause is not a cause of charity. This is an anti-colonial cause. It's a cause for liberation, for justice. Some people look at it as a cause of charity. If you send some money, that will never lead to the liberation of Palestine. Now, what we need you to heed our call. The same way you expected the international community to heed your call. You wanted the international community to intervene. Why did you want the international community to intervene? Because there was a huge power imbalance between the colonizer and the colonized, between the oppressor and the oppressed. Israel has, according to reports, the 4th strongest army in the world, equipped with Merkava tanks, Apache helicopters, F-15, F-16, F-35, and 450 nuclear heads. What do Palestinians have? Nothing. Nothing. Absolutely nothing when it comes to but we have our sumud, our will to fight back. And this is why Israel has not been able to reoccupy Gaza. Thank you.
I think there was another question.
Hello. So I've been thinking with like recent charges, arrest warrants from the ICC that from Netanyahu, like how do we, as the people, not fall for like the pitfall of a sin eater? Like we can see this in America for like systems of police brutality and police violence. It goes from abolish the police to defend the police, and then nothing happens. So how do we as people remain steadfast in our idea and our principles? So that is my question.
Yeah. One way of looking at it, and I'm trying to answer indirectly, actually, because I don't want to repeat myself. Israel would have never been able to commit all the war crimes against humanity, including the gravest crime against humanity, genocide, without the support of the colonial West and American imperialism. In fact, when people say, your problem is with Israel, we have a problem with that. Our problem is not only with Israel. Israel, by definition, and this is the point that I want you to understand, Israel, by definition, is a colonial project implanted in the heart of the Middle East after the Second World War and the end of classical colonialism. In order to protect the interests of the colonial West at that time, it was the UK, France, followed by American imperialism. Now, if you want to understand what is really happening in the Middle East, it is impossible to understand without defining Israel as a colonial project. Now, one issue that I raise in the book here is that the problem with Palestinian nationalism as defined by the Palestinian bourgeoisie, and even by the Islamic resistance movement of Hamas, and people find it surprising that even Hamas itself decided to accept the two-state solution. In 2017, I was there, and they decided to change their charter by accepting an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. And that is a problem. Because Palestinian nationalism, and I'm very critical of Palestinian nationalism, they call me nationalist, but I'm also very critical of Palestinian nationalism, is that it looks at Israel as a colonial, power without analyzing it as a settler colonial phenomenon. And there is a difference between colonialism and settler colonialism. The reason why apartheid Israel is committing a genocide right now in Gaza is exactly the same reason why genocide was committed in Australia, why genocide was committed in North America, in New Zealand, all other settler colonies. Now, the problem here is that the natives are stubborn. In addition to being talkative, of course. They're very, very, very stubborn. I hope I've answered the question.
Okay, thanks, Prof.
I need to see the person talking. I'm sorry, because
I think we are on 10-2, and it's part of closure, but I think maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Okay, Errol.
Thank you, Prof, for that enlightenment. I think fundamentally the idea of freedom and equality, just that idea internationally, must never die. And I think it's our duty as peoples outside of Palestine to foster that idea more and more. Because one has to admit that since October the 6th, 7th, Israel has become more and more a pariah state. And the chokehold on Israel is closing down like never before. And we need to advance that as people from outside. Because I always ask myself, what do you do as an external party to assist the cause within Israel, within Palestine? And so we've got to look at what's available for us to do that. And we need to chip away very, very slowly against the resistance for Palestine by all of these means that we did in South Africa. And of course, here in South Africa, we had a guerrilla movement on the ground, internally, and we had an underground, and we had external wings that were fighting, external wings against apartheid that were fighting. And we managed to harness, with the assistance of the international community, to harness that kind of support. And you're quite right. I mean, Margaret Thatcher and America called the ANC and Mandela as terrorists. Terrorists of today is the freedom fighters and governors of tomorrow. And we always got to remember that. So therefore I'm saying, and when we look at the situation in Palestine and the two-state solution, and I agree 100% with you, but how do we get there? In South Africa, they tried this whole issue of Bantustans, breaking up the country into little pockets, and that kind of thing. We knew we were opposed to that, and it never worked. It will never work in South Africa because we wanted a non-racial democracy. It has its flaws, economic flaws, etc., but it is there. And we can work towards what we still wanted. And I'm always thinking about what's the possibility of a federal kind of state initiated in the whole of Palestine, you know, initially, and then moving towards a unitary state eventually. The other point I want to raise is that I listened to the Palestine representative at the UN after the US opposed the vote. They were the only country that opposed it in the Security Council. I think it's 44-1. Was it yesterday or the day before? And he was amazing in how he plotted out everything, you know. And I could actually see that the American representative, who was a black person, and I know America does this, they put black people into the United Nations to support Israel. They became embarrassed by what he had to say. And so that kind of narrative, we need to maybe people from outside need to be looking, besides BDS, chipping away at sport, for example. Why do we have Israel playing against France still in football? It's crazy, you know. That did not happen when we had apartheid, South Africa isolated, because they were isolated in sport, and that cultural isolation and even academic isolation chokes, it creates the chokehold. And that is what we maybe need to be focusing on the outside. The other point I want to raise is that, I mean, one has always known about propaganda in wars, in politics, and so forth and so forth. But I think Israel has sort of, I don't know if I can say, perfected this thing about how they propagate people to believe lies, because they believe it themselves, you know. And we should also be looking at, and I know there are sectors of society that are looking at dissecting the kind of propaganda and coming up with proper narratives. But we got to look at how we go up against the propaganda. And I mean, the common thing of Israel has the right to protect itself is crazy as an answer to each and every argument, you know. And so that whole issue around propaganda that is being spread throughout the world, we got to chip away at that as well so that people can start to believe. And I mean, we can't solve all the problems, all the challenges, but we have to look at what we're capable of outside of Israel and Palestine itself, what we are capable of, and start small little movements to chip away against those resistance. Thank you.
Thanks, Errol. That was 3 in 1. Thank you. You took all the questions.
I take that as a comment, actually. I mean, I tend to agree with that. No, I take it as a comment, but you know, I want to add something. You know, Israel denies the very existence of the Palestinian people. I mean, and as a Zionist project, it was based on myths. And the first myth is that, of course, it's the promised land. It's a land without a people for a people without a land. In the 19th century, the Zionist conference, the first Zionist conference, decided to send 2 rabbis to find out how empty was the land in Palestine. The 2 rabbis went to Jerusalem, moved around in Palestine, and they sent a letter back saying, the bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man. And I'm sure you are getting the point that, you know, and that was the beginning of the idea of, you know, settler colonialism in Palestine, establishing a settler colony, forcing the people to recognize it, based on the idea that it doesn't have no natives. No natives ever lived there. Move forward to the current government, the most fascist government in the history of the state, and I think in the world now, in the history of the state of Israel. Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, there are 2 fascist ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Of course, the whole government is fascist, you know, but the most fascist. Smotrich, at the beginning of the genocide, he said the Palestinians, on record, you can find it on, by the way, on YouTube. He said, Palestinians have one option only. One, to leave Palestine. Two, or to become our slaves, and if they don't do that, we kill them. And this is what they are doing right now. Taking us back, to your point, and notice most of the questions, the reference point is South Africa, notice. Every single question. In South Africa, we used to do that. In South Africa, I understand. In Ireland, when I went and I gave talks, online, in Ireland, we used to do this and to do that. But again, don't forget, I'm saying it's a multi-tiered system of oppression. Now, if you want a federal solution as the first step, give me any solution. I would accept it if it guarantees my basic rights. Okay, 3 states, 4 states. If you guarantee my right of return, if you guarantee equality, and if you guarantee my freedom, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. And by the way, this is not only my personal opinion. There is an overwhelming consensus in Palestine about that. This is what brings Fatah with Hamas, with the PFLP. I've sat with leaders from those parties, and they agree. And this is why we managed, or how rather, we managed in 2005 to get the endorsements of all political orientations in Palestine, based on rights-based orientation. Right? So federal state, I don't believe that. Personally, no. No, a secular democratic state. Federal, 3 states, 4 states. Confederal, if it guarantees my basic rights, I'm okay with that. But I want you to think about it. The basic rights I'm talking about, and I'm sure you agree with me about basic rights, guaranteed under international law. Other than a secular democratic state, what political vision can you think of that guarantee my basic rights? And I said, we are open for discussion, by the way. And there is a debate in Palestine, believe me. There is a very rich debate taking place right now in Palestine that you people don't get to hear about because mainstream media keeps repeating the same mantra of the 2-state solution, bringing the 2 parties to the negotiating table. Which 2 parties? And what negotiating table are you talking about? We've been negotiating since 1993, leading where? Leading to the end of the idea of independence. So again, I would take you back to basic rights. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Haidar. When I said 3 in 1, I meant we're going to close on the questions. So I'd like to call on Professor Keir to just come up and hand over a gift to Samira as we close our session, and we say thank you so much to you, Prof, and thank you to the audience. There is some food just through that door over there. I saw some lovely watermelons. So we can eat some resistance food as well. Thank you so much for coming out this evening.
زرعنا المرامية عباب الدار فلسطين